Welcome back to Snowy Owl Knits. Today I'm going to show you a tubular cast-on hack, as I'd like to call it, that's really great for using with ribbing. In these two swatches, I've done a long tail cast-on in this sample, and it doesn't match quite nicely with the ribbing. In this sample, you almost feel like there's no cast on at all because the look is such that it appears that the knit stitch just wraps right around the work. It's a good, neat, clean finish, and typically the setup for a tubular cast on is quite long and involved. I've been using this hack that I'll show you for the garments that I'm making my granddaughter, and once you have done it once, it's really quite simple, and the results are spectacular. We don't have a cast on where you're trying to maneuver your fingers and pull up yarn several different ways. We also are not having to work several setup rows in order to achieve this final look. So if you want to follow along in the tutorial, you will need, of course, your working yarn. Let me draw my end out here. I'm sticking with the gray just for this tutorial. And you'll need a contrasting yarn. And I'm using a yarn that is wool, and it is smaller, but really, with the crochet chain, this is not a problem. As long as I can see what I'm doing, it works. You will need a crochet needle, your knitting needles, and you'll probably find that it's helpful to have a pair of scissors. Something with a fine tip works really well. So let's get started with this. We'll start with our contrast yarn and our crochet hook and tie a simple slip knot to start. Get it up on our needle. And we are going to do a crochet chain of at least as many stitches as you wish to have on your project. So if I just want to do a small sample like I'm going to do today, and I want 6 stitches, I want at least 6 loops in my chain. But I like to do extra so that I have something to grab onto and things aren't unraveling. So I'm just going to pull up at least 6, I'll probably do 12 stitches. We don't want the chain too loose. We don't want it too small. After all, we are going to use the chain to pull up a thicker yarn. Now, if you have scrap yarn that is of the same size, you can kind of work with, try it a few times with different loop sizes and see how that works for you. I need to pull out just a little more yarn. Okay, we'll get a couple more going. And you'll see why I draw up a little bit extra. So on this final loop, rather than pulling it all the way through and tightening it, I'm going to leave a long loop here and just snip the thread at this point. On a crochet chain, one side has what looks like a row of the V's or hearts, which we are used to seeing in knitting, and on the other side we have these bars or bumps like spines coming out of the chain. And that's what we'll be working with today. So we're just going to leave this end hanging, and I'm going to go in a few bumps, and I'm going to use my crochet chain just one more time to pull a loop of my working yarn up onto or through that chain bump. And once I have that in place, we're done with the crochet hook. So I'm going to take the tail of my working yarn and the rest of the chain and just sort of hold them out of the way. I like to have a little bit of tension as I go. So we have drawn up a loop through one bar. We're going to skip the next bar and we're going to go into that third loop from the chain and pull up another loop onto our needle. And again, skip a bump, pull up another loop, and we'll keep this short. I need more working yarn. Skip a bump and pull up a loop. So at this point, you want to turn your working yarn or your work to this other side. And when you look at what we have on our needle, you can see that it looks like we have purl bumps with our contrast color. That's exactly what it is. Those stitches will become our pearls. So just holding everything in place down here to keep the tension, I am going to grab my other knitting needle and purl that first stitch. And pull it off of the needle, off of the left needle. In between my two needles now, between the right and left, you can see our working yarn as a running thread. So we're going to go from the front to the back under that working yarn and pull another loop up. And this becomes a knit stitch. And one thing I will mention when you're doing this, as you're working farther and farther down the chain, because you're working the yarn, you're increasing the tension on the contrast color and on your working yarn. And it becomes slightly more difficult to grab that working yarn if you've exerted too much tension. So I've just done my purl. I go down here and go from the front to the back under my working yarn, not the contrast, and knitting that up onto my needle. And you can see that I am being careful just to not exert too much tension. So we have a purl, and going from the front to the back, picking up that working yarn, knitting it up onto our needle. I'm just trying to make sure I'm not splitting anything. And continue just to get that last purl. I'm holding on to my yarn here with my left hand just to keep that tension, even though I will be able to snug that up later. Okay, and that completes what we need to have accomplished so far. So now on our needle we have knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit. And this is really great to have the knit on either end, because if you're doing a slip stitch edge like I like to do, that is really optimal. But what we want to do is work one more row with our chain attached, just to kind of solidify everything. And what you've done so far is one row. So it's really not like a bind-on, and that's what gives it its seamless look that just rolls around one side of the work to the other. I'm just doing the 1x1 ribbing. I've got a purl and a knit. And now we can unzip our work. So I'll just put my knitting needle down. Here is our loop from where we, pulled it through, just to kind of keep it viable. I will mention that at this one point on our last stitch, I have found that as I'm unzipping, that quite frequently is the tightest place, and that yarn does want to stick. And so I have my fine point scissors ready just in case. If you want to at this point, you can snip off an end, of course being careful not to get into your working yarn. And you can also snip there, but let's see how this unravels or unzips. I like to hold on to my needles as I'm doing this, even though they're securely there. I just begin by pulling that loop out and pulling my yarn through. And as I suspected, this last little bit, this last loop is a bit tight. I'm going to go ahead and just carefully snip just right here. I'm not getting my working yarn, that would be a disaster for me. And I'm pulling out the rest of my yarn. And you can see already, without working any further, our knit and purl stitches really are just rolling from one side to the other. And that's all there is to that. It's a very simple procedure. I highly recommend it. And hey, if you liked this hack, if you liked the idea of not doing setups, you want to use this, please hit that like button, and we will see you next time on Snowy Owl Knits. Thanks so much. You guys be safe, healthy, and love each other. We need more of that in the world.